I went to my professor's office for extra credit and found his body. His office was on the third floor of this creepy building that was always empty after 4 p.m. I texted my roommate Holden on the way over, telling him I'd be back late because I had to kiss up to Adomo for at least an hour. He texted back a thumbs up and told me good luck. I climbed the stairs to his floor and walked down the long hallway to his office. The door was closed and I knocked twice. No answer. I knocked again and called his name. Still nothing. I tried the doorknob and it turned, so I pushed the door open. Professor Adomo was slumped over his desk with his head down like he'd fallen asleep. I said his name again, louder this time, and that's when I saw the blood pooling underneath his head and dripping onto the floor. I screamed and pulled out my phone to call the police. Campus security got there first, then real police officers, then detectives in suits. They asked me a million questions while I stood in the hallway shaking. How did you get in? Was the door locked? Who else knew about this meeting? I told them the door was unlocked when I got there, that I just turned the knob and walked in. That's when one of the detectives checked the door and his face changed. He called the other detective over and they both looked at the lock, then looked at me. The detective explained that this door locks automatically from the inside when you close it. You need a key to unlock it from the hallway, or you have to turn the deadbolt from inside the office. If the door was unlocked when I arrived, someone had to unlock it from the inside right before I got there. The windows don't open and there's no other way out of the room. I was the only person in that hallway. They took me down to the police station. A detective named Williams listed all the evidence against me like he was reading off a shopping list. I had a reason to want him dead because I was failing his class and had sent him emails begging to pass. I had a meeting scheduled in his calendar, so I had opportunity. My fingerprints were all over his office because I'd been in there before. The security camera at the building's main entrance showed me walking in, but nobody else had entered for 2 whole hours before that. The weapon was a heavy stone bookend from his shelf, and they found my prints on books near it. I told them someone else had to be there, but they just stared at me like I was making it up. How could someone else be there in a locked room? I kept thinking about everyone who might want to hurt him. There was his teaching assistant who people said he was sleeping with. There was the student he failed who posted angry stuff about him online. There was his ex-wife who he was fighting with over their kids. I remembered weird things from the crime scene that didn't make sense. His coffee cup was still warm when I touched it. His computer was open to an email he was typing. His jacket was thrown over his chair like he'd just gotten there. None of it felt right. I asked Detective Williams about the timing, when exactly he died, but he wouldn't tell me anything. They kept me there for 6 hours asking the same questions over and over, until finally they let me go home, but told me not to leave town. 3 days later, Detective Williams called and told me to come back to the station immediately. I thought he was going to arrest me, and I almost threw up in the car on the way there. But when I got to his office, he showed me a paper with a bunch of numbers and charts on it. He explained that based on how cold the body was and how stiff it had gotten, Professor Adomo had been dead for at least 3 hours before I even walked into that building. There was no way I killed him. I felt like I could breathe for the first time in days. But then he asked the question that made my blood run cold. So who unlocked that door? They'd gone back through all the security footage and found something they missed before. Someone left through the emergency exit stairwell at the back of the building 2 hours before my appointment. That stairwell doesn't have cameras, but it sets off a silent alarm when you open it. Whoever killed Professor Adomo heard me coming up the stairs, ran to unlock his door from the inside, then slipped out through the emergency exit while I was walking down the hallway. They used my appointment to escape and make me look guilty. Detective Williams pulled up a grainy photo on his computer from a camera near the stairwell. Do you recognize this person? I leaned forward to look at the screen and my whole body went cold. It was Holden, my roommate. The guy I'd texted before going into that building. The guy who told me good luck. The detective frowned at his computer and said, he was supposed to come in for a witness statement an hour ago, but he never showed up. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw a text from Holden that made my hands start shaking. I know you talked to them. I'm so sorry it has to be this way. Then he sent me a photo. I stare at my phone screen where the text glows with words that make my hands shake. The photo takes forever to load, and I watch the little circle spin while my heart pounds. When it finally appears, I see myself walking into Professor Adomo's building that day. The angle makes it look like I'm checking over my shoulder in a nervous way. Detective Williams leans forward across his desk. He asks what's wrong. I turn my phone around to show him, and my voice barely works when I try to speak. He grabs the phone from my hand and his face goes hard. He picks up his desk phone and starts making calls fast. He asks where Holden might go, but I realize I don't actually know much about my roommate's life outside our dorm. I sit there feeling stupid while he talks to campus security and then local police. How did I live with someone for 3 months and not notice anything wrong with him? The guy's stuff was 5 feet from mine every single night. Detective Williams hangs up and asks me direct questions about Holden's schedule, friends, habits, family. I tell him Holden is from somewhere in state and has a part-time job at the campus bookstore. He mostly keeps to himself except for being friendly with me. As I talk, I realize how little I actually know about someone who slept in the same room as me. That makes everything feel worse. A man in a suit walks in fast, and Detective Williams introduces him as Mitch Grimes, his partner. They start talking in low voices about setting up a search and treating me like I might be in danger. Mitch asks if I have somewhere safe to stay, and Detective Williams says they're keeping me here for now. They move me to a smaller room down the hall. An officer stands outside the door. Detective Williams sits across from me at a table and pulls out a notebook. He asks me everything about Holden. What time does he wake up? Where does he eat lunch? Does he have a car? What kind? Does he talk about family or friends? I answer what I can, but most of my answers are, I don't know, or I'm not sure. Holden works at the bookstore on Tuesdays and Thursdays. He drives an old blue Honda. He mentioned his parents are divorced, but never said much else. He doesn't really hang out with anyone that I've seen. Detective Williams writes it all down, but I can tell he's not getting much useful information. He asks if Holden ever mentioned Professor Adomo, and I say no, never. Did he seem angry or upset lately? Not that I noticed. Did he go anywhere unusual? Just class and work, as far as I know. Every question makes me feel more like an idiot for missing whatever was happening right under my nose. Detective Williams leaves the room and comes back with his laptop. He opens it and turns the screen toward me. He shows me security footage from the building where Professor Adomo died. I watch my roommate move quickly down the back stairwell. The timestamp at the bottom shows the exact time. He exited 2 minutes before I knocked on the professor's door. 2 minutes. He waited until the last possible second. I feel sick realizing how perfectly he timed it so that I would be the one to find the body and take the blame. Detective Williams points at the screen and explains that Holden must have heard me coming up the front stairs. He ran to unlock the door from inside, then slipped out through the emergency exit while I was walking down the hallway to the office. The timing was so exact that we probably passed each other with just one floor and a wall between us. I ask if the cameras show him going into the building earlier, and Detective Williams nods. Holden entered through a side door 3 hours before I got there. That matches when the professor actually died. Mitch Grimes comes back into the room with his phone in his hand. He tells Detective Williams that Holden's car is gone from the campus parking lot. His manager at the bookstore called saying Holden didn't show up for his shift today. They've sent out alerts to all the police departments around here and highway patrol to watch for his car. Detective Williams asks me if Holden has mentioned any places he likes to go, any family property or friends' houses where he might hide. I draw a complete blank because we never talked about anything that personal. I don't even know what town his parents live in. A campus security officer walks in carrying a laptop. Detective Williams introduces him as Owen Hamilton. Owen sets up his computer and shows us more footage from different cameras around campus over the past few weeks. He points out several clips of Holden following Professor Adomo at a distance. In one video, Holden lurks near the professor's office building. In another, he sits in his car watching the professor's parking spot. I never knew Holden was doing any of this. I feel like a complete idiot for missing such obvious stalking behavior from someone I saw every single day. We ate breakfast together. We talked about homework. How did I not see this? Owen mentions that Holden came up to him about 3 weeks ago, asking weird questions about the building's security system. Holden claimed he was interested in campus safety for a class project. Owen thought it was a little strange, but answered his questions because students ask about security sometimes. Now those questions make horrible sense. Holden was researching how to avoid cameras and where the blind spots were. He was planning this for weeks. Detective Williams makes notes in his notebook, while I try to remember if Holden ever said anything about Professor Adomo. I can't recall him even mentioning the professor's name. Not once. Detective Williams's phone rings and he steps out to answer it. His expression changes while he listens to whoever is calling. He hangs up and comes back into the room. He tells me they found something in our dorm room. Campus police searched it with a warrant about an hour ago. They discovered a notebook hidden under Holden's mattress. The notebook is filled with details about Professor Adomo's schedule, routines, and movements. There are also printed emails between the professor and his teaching assistant, Abigail Fisher. Holden somehow got into the professor's email account and printed private messages. Detective Williams shows me photos of the notebook pages on his phone. I see Holden's handwriting listing times and locations. He wrote down when the professor arrived at his office and when he left. He noted what coffee shop the professor went to. He tracked everything. I ask why Holden would want to kill Professor Adomo. Detective Williams says that's what they need to figure out, because Holden wasn't even in any of the professor's classes. Mitch Grimes suggests maybe it was about Abigail Fisher since the notebook mentions her repeatedly. But I tell them I've never heard Holden mention her either. The two detectives exchange looks that tell me they're thinking about possibilities they don't want to share with me yet. Detective Williams says I can call my parents now if I want. I pull out my phone with shaking hands and dial my mom. She answers on the second ring. I break down trying to explain that my roommate is a murderer who tried to frame me and is now on the run. My mom starts crying on the other end. My dad gets on the phone and demands to know if I'm safe. I tell them the police are protecting me, but I don't feel safe anywhere anymore. They want to drive up here right now. Detective Williams takes the phone from me and talks to my parents. He tells them it's better if they stay home for now in case Holden tries to contact them or show up there. He promises them I'm safe at the station. He gives them his direct number. When he hands my phone back, my mom is still crying. My dad tells me to do whatever the police say. I hang up feeling empty and scared and completely lost. The door opens, and a woman with gray hair and a tired face walks in carrying a leather bag. Detective Williams stands up and they shake hands while I sit there trying to pull myself together. She comes over and sits in the chair next to me, putting her hand on my arm. She tells me her name is Sabine Melendez, and she's my academic advisor from the university. She heard what happened and came right away to make sure I'm okay. I nod, but don't really know what to say. Sabine explains that the university is providing security for my dorm, and they're offering to move me to a different room if I want. The idea of going back to that space where I lived with Holden makes my stomach hurt. I ask if I can just go home for a while instead. She says she'll work with my professors to let me finish the semester remotely if that's what I need. Detective Williams steps out to take a call, and Sabine stays with me, asking gentle questions about my classes and whether I have friends on campus. I answer, but my mind keeps going back to Holden and how I never noticed anything wrong. About 20 minutes later, Detective Williams comes back carrying a stack of papers. He sits down across from me and spreads them out on the desk. He tells me these are pages from Holden's notebook that campus police found hidden under his mattress. I lean forward to look and my whole body goes cold. The pages are filled with Holden's handwriting. He wrote about me specifically. My name appears over and over with notes about my schedule and what classes I'm taking. There's a whole section about Professor Adomo's class and how I was struggling and had that appointment scheduled. Holden wrote down the exact time and date. There are calculations about timing and distances. Notes that say things like perfect alibi and locked room will confuse them and he'll panic and look guilty. I stare at the words and realize Holden didn't just frame me by accident or convenience. He planned it specifically around me. He chose me deliberately as his fall guy, and I have no idea why. Detective Williams points to another page where Holden drew a timeline showing when he needed to be in position and when I would arrive. Every detail was mapped out weeks in advance. Sabine looks over my shoulder at the pages and her face goes pale. She asks Detective Williams if this means Holden targeted the narrator on purpose, and he nods. I feel sick thinking about all those times Holden asked casual questions about my schedule or what classes I was taking. He was gathering information to use against me. Detective Williams gets a call on his desk phone and listens for a minute before hanging up. He tells me a forensics report just came in about the murder weapon. The stone bookend they found has only Professor Adomo's blood on it, which makes sense. But they found Holden's fingerprints on books near where the bookend usually sat on the shelf. More important, they found a pair of latex gloves in the emergency exit stairwell. The gloves have tiny spots of blood on them that match the professor. Detective Williams explains that Holden must have worn the gloves during the murder, then pulled them off right before he left through the emergency exit. He probably thought he was being careful but didn't realize he left evidence behind. The gloves prove Holden was there and handled something with the professor's blood on it. I ask if that's enough to convict him, and Detective Williams says combined with everything else, the case is solid. Owen Hamilton from campus security shows up with a laptop. He sets it on the desk and opens a video file. The footage is from the campus bookstore where Holden works. We watch Holden standing behind the register helping customers just hours before he killed Professor Adomo. He's smiling and joking around with people buying textbooks. A girl asks him something and he laughs and points to a shelf. He looks completely normal, totally ordinary. I feel disturbed watching him act so casual when he was planning to murder someone that same day. Detective Williams points at the screen and tells me to watch Holden's hands. Every few minutes, Holden pulls out his phone and checks it. He's not texting or scrolling, just checking the time. Detective Williams says Holden was probably monitoring when he needed to get into position. The footage shows Holden's shift ending at 3 and him walking out the back door of the bookstore. Professor Adomo died around 4 based on the forensics timeline. That gave Holden an hour to get to the building and set up. Mitch Grimes comes into the office looking excited. He tells Detective Williams they got a ping on Holden's phone from the cell towers. The signal shows he's about 2 hours north of campus heading toward the state border. They're coordinating with state police right now to set up checkpoints on the highways. They're also starting aerial surveillance to track his car. Detective Williams asks me if Holden ever mentioned anything about Canada or Mexico or anywhere he might try to run. I tell him Holden barely mentioned anything about his life at all. We lived together for 3 months and I realize I don't know basic things about him like where he's from or if he has family. Mitch leaves to coordinate the search, and I sit there feeling stupid for not paying more attention. A young woman with dark hair appears at the door asking for Detective Williams. He waves her in and she looks nervous. She tells him her name is Trinity Harding, and she has information about Holden. Detective Williams asks her to sit down, and she takes the chair next to Sabine. Trinity glances at me and asks if I'm the roommate, and I nod. She takes a breath and explains that she dated Holden briefly last year. They went out for maybe 6 weeks before she broke up with him. I ask why she ended it, and Trinity says he became obsessive and controlling. He wanted to know where she was all the time. He got mad when she hung out with friends without him. After they broke up, she started seeing someone else, and Holden followed her around campus for weeks. Trinity says she would see him sitting in the library watching her or standing outside her dorm. Her friends noticed him too. It got bad enough that campus security warned him to stop. But Trinity never filed official charges because he eventually seemed to back off and leave her alone. Detective Williams asks if Holden ever got violent, and Trinity shakes her head. She says he never touched her or threatened her directly. He just watched and followed and made her uncomfortable. Trinity shifts in her chair and says there's something else. She tells us that Holden talked about Professor Adomo even back when they were dating. He would mention how the professor was a fraud who didn't deserve his position and treated students badly. Trinity didn't think much of it at the time because lots of students complain about professors, but now she realizes Holden's hatred seemed more personal and intense than normal. He would get worked up talking about how Professor Adomo was ruining lives and getting away with it. Trinity also mentions that Holden was weirdly interested in true crime shows. They would watch them together and he would pause the episodes to analyze how the killers got caught. He would talk about what mistakes they made and how they should have done things differently. At the time, Trinity thought it was just a strange hobby, but now it makes her skin crawl. Detective Williams thanks her for coming in and takes her contact information. After Trinity leaves, Detective Williams gets another call. He listens and his eyebrows go up. He hangs up and tells me that someone named Wayne Fuller just called. Wayne saw the news coverage about Holden and contacted police with information. Wayne was Holden's roommate freshman year before requesting a room change. He says Holden had serious problems even back then. Wayne is coming to the station right now to give a statement. I feel dread building in my chest, wondering what else I'm about to learn about the person I've been living with. About 30 minutes later, a guy around my age walks in wearing a university sweatshirt. Detective Williams brings him over and introduces him as Wayne. Wayne sits down and looks uncomfortable. He tells us that Holden became fixated on a girl in their dorm freshman year. Holden would follow her and take photos of her without permission. The girl's friends eventually confronted him about it. Wayne also says Holden had violent outbursts when things didn't go his way. One time, Holden got a bad grade on a paper and punched a hole in their dorm wall. Wayne had to cover it with a poster before the RA saw it. The final thing that made Wayne request the room change was finding a knife under Holden's pillow. When Wayne asked about it, Holden said he needed protection. But then Holden started making comments about people who wronged him deserving consequences. Wayne got scared and went to housing to request a new room. I asked Wayne why none of this is in any official records or why Holden wasn't kicked out of school. Wayne looks down and admits he never filed a formal complaint. When he told Holden he was moving out, Holden apologized and seemed to calm down. Wayne just wanted to get away from him, so he didn't push it further. The university processed it as a normal roommate incompatibility situation. Detective Williams looks frustrated hearing this. He says it means Holden's dangerous patterns were never documented in any way that would have flagged him. Wayne could have prevented this by reporting what happened, but he was just a scared freshman who wanted to move on. Nobody knew Holden was a threat because nobody ever made it official. I sit there thinking about how many warning signs there were and how many people saw pieces of who Holden really was, but nobody put it all together until it was too late. Detective Williams pulled out the notebook they found under Holden's mattress and spread the pages across his desk. Wayne leaned forward and his face went pale as he looked at the handwriting. He nodded slowly and confirmed it was definitely Holden's writing, same obsessive detail and tiny letters he remembered from freshman year. Wayne picked up one page and pointed at how Holden wrote the same phrase over and over in the margins, and he said that was exactly the kind of thing Holden used to do with homework assignments. Detective Williams asked Wayne about Holden's family, and Wayne mentioned that Holden's parents got divorced when he was in middle school. He said Holden's dad was some kind of lawyer who apparently got Holden out of trouble in high school for something serious, but Wayne never learned the details because Holden wouldn't talk about it. Detective Williams and Mitch exchanged looks, and Detective Williams immediately started searching for information about Holden's father. Within minutes, they found him listed as a defense attorney practicing in the state capitol about 3 hours away. Detective Williams picked up his phone and dialed the number while putting it on speaker so we could all hear. A professional voice answered, identifying himself as Holden's father, and Detective Williams explained who he was and why he was calling. There was a long silence on the other end, and then Holden's dad let out a breath that sounded shocked, but not entirely surprised, which made my skin crawl. He said he hadn't heard from Holden in 6 months after they had a big fight about something he wouldn't specify. Detective Williams asked if he had any idea where Holden might run, or if he had friends or family in other states. Holden's dad said he refused to speculate about his son's whereabouts and that he needed to consult with colleagues before saying anything else. He agreed to call immediately if Holden contacted him, but his tone was cold and formal in a way that made me doubt he would actually cooperate. Detective Williams thanked him and hung up, then said something under his breath about lawyers protecting their own, even when their own kids are murderers. Mitch came back into the room carrying his phone and told us that state police just reported spotting Holden's car at a rest stop about 2 hours north. Detective Williams jumped up and asked if they had him in custody, but Mitch shook his head and explained that by the time officers arrived at the rest stop, Holden had already left. Worse than that, they discovered he had switched his license plates with one stolen from another vehicle in the parking lot. Detective Williams cursed under his breath and said this meant Holden planned his escape in advance and had been preparing for this possibility. The detectives started making more calls to coordinate with Highway Patrol and set up alerts for the stolen plates. I sat there feeling sick, as I realized Holden must have been planning this for days or weeks, thinking through every detail of how to get away. Mitch disappeared again and came back about 20 minutes later, carrying printed bank records. He spread them on the desk and showed us that Holden withdrew $5,000 in cash from his bank account 2 days before the murder. Detective Williams pointed at the withdrawal and said Holden must be using cash to avoid credit card tracking. Mitch also pulled up records showing that Holden purchased a burner phone last week from an electronics store, and they had no way to trace it since he probably paid cash and never activated it with his real information. Every new detail they found revealed more planning and calculation, and I felt increasingly disturbed thinking about how this person slept 6 feet away from me every night while plotting murder and preparing to run. Detective Williams looked at the notebook again and flipped to a page where Abigail's name appeared over and over with hearts and angry scribbles. He said they needed to bring her in for questioning because clearly she was connected to Holden's motive somehow. About an hour later, Detective Williams led me to a small observation room with a one-way mirror looking into an interview room. He told me to wait there while they talked to Abigail, and he wanted me to watch in case I recognized anything or had information that could help. I sat down in the dark observation room and watched as a woman in her mid-20s walked in looking scared and confused. She had long dark hair and was wearing a university staff badge. Detective Williams and Mitch sat across from her and explained why they asked her to come in. Abigail's hands were shaking as she insisted she never met anyone named Holden and had no idea why he would be obsessed with her. Detective Williams showed her some of the notebook pages with her name on them, and her face went white as she read Holden's writing. She started crying and said she didn't understand any of this. Mitch asked her about her relationship with Professor Adomo, and Abigail looked down at the table for a long time before answering. She admitted they were having an affair, and that it started about 8 months ago when she became his teaching assistant. She said Professor Adomo was planning to leave his wife for her, which made her feel guilty, but also hopeful about their future together. Detective Williams asked if she noticed anyone following her or acting strange around her, and Abigail thought for a minute before saying she had seen the same person in a hoodie outside the building several times over the past month. She never saw his face clearly enough to identify him because he always had the hood up and stayed far away. Abigail suddenly stopped talking and asked why they were asking all these questions, and Detective Williams told her that Professor Adomo was dead. She made a sound like all the air left her body and started sobbing, so hard she could barely breathe. She kept saying no over and over and asking what happened. Detective Williams explained that someone she never met killed him, possibly because of jealousy over their relationship, and Abigail put her head down on the table and cried harder. After a few minutes, she pulled out her phone with shaking hands and showed the detectives text messages from Professor Adomo. I could see them on the screen from the observation room, messages about how happy he was and how they would be together soon. Abigail scrolled through dozens of messages, and her whole body was shaking. Detective Williams asked again about the person in the hoodie, and Abigail wiped her eyes and said she mentioned it to Professor Adomo a few weeks ago. She said he seemed nervous when she told him and admitted he felt like someone was watching him lately, but he thought it was his ex-wife having him followed for the custody case. Detective Williams wrote something down and exchanged a look with Mitch. He realized out loud that Holden's stalking was noticed, but everyone misinterpreted it, which let him continue without anyone intervening. Mitch pulled out photos of Holden from his student ID and social media, and he slid them across the table to Abigail. She picked them up and stared at them for a long time, then nodded slowly and said he looked like the person she saw lurking around. She couldn't be completely certain because of the hoodie, but the height and build matched. She started crying again and said if she had reported it or pushed Professor Adomo to call campus security, maybe he would still be alive. Detective Williams left Abigail in the interview room with a victim advocate and came into the observation room where I was sitting. He said they were going to keep investigating Holden's connection to Abigail, and he asked if I ever heard Holden mention her name. I told him I never heard Holden talk about any girl, which now seemed like another red flag I missed. A uniformed officer knocked on the door and told Detective Williams that someone named Barrett was here asking to talk to him about the case. Detective Williams looked surprised and told the officer to bring him in. A few minutes later, a guy around my age walked into the interview room wearing jeans and a university hoodie. He looked nervous but determined as he sat down across from Detective Williams and Mitch. Barrett explained that he saw the news coverage about Professor Adomo's murder and wanted to clear his name since he knew people might suspect him. He pulled out his phone and showed Detective Williams his social media posts criticizing the professor's grading policies and teaching methods. He admitted he was angry about failing the class and thought the professor was unfair, but he insisted he would never actually hurt anyone. Detective Williams asked where he was during the time of the murder, and Barrett immediately pulled up photos on his phone showing him in a different state visiting family. He had dozens of witnesses, including his parents, grandparents, and cousins, plus time-stamped photos from that whole weekend. Mitch checked the dates and confirmed Barrett's alibi was solid, and there was no way he could have been on campus when Professor Adomo died. Barrett shifted in his seat and said there was something else Detective Williams should know about. He explained that someone with a fake social media account had been messaging him for weeks, encouraging him to escalate his complaints about Professor Adomo. Barrett showed them screenshots of messages where this person suggested he should confront the professor physically and make him pay for being such a bad teacher. Barrett said he thought it was just some internet troll trying to start drama, so he ignored the messages and eventually blocked the account. Detective Williams took Barrett's phone and started examining the messages more carefully. He asked Mitch to trace the account, and Mitch pulled out his laptop and started typing. After about 10 minutes, Mitch looked up with a grim expression and said the messages came from an IP address in the campus library. He pulled up library computer logs and found that Holden had signed into that specific computer multiple times during the period when the messages were sent. Detective Williams sat back in his chair and said this revealed that Holden was trying to create multiple suspects and stir up conflict around the professor. He was manipulating Barrett to make him look more suspicious while Holden planned the actual murder. Barrett looked sick as he realized he was used as part of someone's murder plan. After Barrett left, another woman arrived at the station looking angry and defensive. Detective Williams introduced her to me through the observation window as Caroline Kemp, Professor Adomo's ex-wife. She sat down in the interview room and immediately started complaining about being treated like a suspect when she was the victim of her ex-husband's affair. Detective Williams stayed calm and explained they were just gathering information from everyone connected to the case. Caroline admitted they were in a bitter custody battle over their 2 kids and that she resented him for cheating on her with Abigail. She said some harsh things about how he deserved to lose everything in the divorce, but then she stopped and said she never wanted him dead. Detective Williams asked where she was at the time of the murder, and Caroline pulled out her phone to show her calendar. She said she was in court in another county at the exact time of the murder with her lawyer and multiple witnesses. Mitch verified her story with phone calls, and her alibi checked out completely. Detective Williams pulled out a photo of Holden and asked if she ever hired anyone to follow her ex-husband. Caroline said no immediately, but then she looked uncomfortable and shifted in her seat. Detective Williams pressed her on why she looked nervous, and Caroline finally admitted something that made the whole picture more complicated. She pulled out her phone and showed Detective Williams' contact information for a licensed private investigator she hired to document the affair for her custody case. She also had printed reports and photos the investigator provided through completely legal channels, all time-stamped and professionally documented. Detective Williams examined the materials carefully while I watched through the observation window. The PI had been following Professor Adomo during the exact same time frame that Holden was stalking him, which meant Holden could have noticed the actual investigator and used that as cover for his own behavior. If anyone saw Holden lurking around the building or following the professor, they would just assume he was the hired PI that everyone knew Caroline had working on her case. Detective Williams looked up from the documents and explained this theory to Caroline. She looked relieved that she was cleared, but also disturbed that someone had used her legal actions as camouflage for planning murder. After Caroline left, Detective Williams got a phone call that made him sit up straight in his chair. He listened for a minute, then started making notes fast. When he hung up, he told me that a gas station attendant 2 states away had called police after recognizing Holden from news coverage. The attendant said Holden bought snacks and used the bathroom about 3 hours ago, and security footage from the gas station confirmed it was definitely him. State police were already moving into the area to set up roadblocks and search perimeters. Detective Williams made more calls coordinating with the state police while I sat there in his office feeling completely useless. Officers around the station started moving faster, checking maps, organizing search teams, and I just watched it all happen. The fear built up in my chest as I realized they were actually about to find him, and I had no idea what would happen when they did. Would he fight back? Would he run? Would he hurt someone? I asked Detective Williams what would happen to me after they caught Holden. He stopped what he was doing and looked at me seriously. He explained that I would need to testify at trial about finding the body and about living with Holden for months without noticing his behavior. The prosecutor would also want me to testify about the threatening text and photo he sent me to establish his consciousness of guilt. I felt my stomach drop as he talked. The idea of sitting in a courtroom with Holden there, having to relive finding Professor Adomo's body in front of a jury, facing questions from his defense attorney who would try to make me look suspicious or stupid, it all felt too much. Detective Williams must have seen my face change because he told me not to worry about that yet, that we had to catch him first. Sabine Melendez called me later that afternoon and offered to help me arrange to finish my classes remotely for the rest of the semester. She said she had already talked to my professors, and they were all understanding given the circumstances. She also gave me the contact information for a campus counselor who works with students dealing with trauma, and I scheduled my first appointment for the following week. The university offered to pay for a hotel room near campus because there was no way I could go back to that dorm room where I had lived with Holden. Even knowing he was gone and locked up somewhere, the thought of sleeping in that space where his stuff had been right next to mine made me feel physically sick. I packed some clothes and my laptop and moved into a basic hotel room with boring beige walls and generic furniture, but at least it was mine and safe, and Holden had never been there. The next day I was back at the police station when breaking news interrupted everything. Police had Holden's car surrounded in a motel parking lot. Everyone in the station stopped what they were doing, and gathered around the TV screens mounted on the walls. I watched aerial footage from news helicopters showing police vehicles blocking every exit from the parking lot. Officers in tactical gear wearing vests and carrying weapons moved into position around a specific motel room. My heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, and my hands got sweaty. This was actually happening right now. My roommate, the guy who had helped me study for tests and made jokes about our professors, was the person those armed officers were treating as armed and dangerous. The news anchor kept talking about the manhunt and the murder investigation, and I saw my own name flash on the screen as the student who discovered Professor Adomo's body. The standoff went on for 2 hours. I sat in Detective Williams's office watching the whole thing unfold on TV while he got updates by phone from the officers on scene. Negotiators were trying to get Holden to surrender peacefully. The whole situation felt surreal and disconnected, like I was watching a movie instead of real events involving someone I actually knew. Officers kept their positions around the motel room. The news helicopters circled overhead, filming everything, and everyone just waited. Then suddenly Holden walked out of the motel room with his hands raised high above his head. Officers rushed forward from multiple directions and arrested him without any fight or resistance. Detective Williams got confirmation by phone and turned to look at me. He said it was over and they had Holden in custody. I thought I would feel relieved, but instead I just felt numb and completely exhausted, like all the fear and tension from the past few days was draining out of my body and leaving me empty. Detective Williams explained that Holden was transported back here to face charges and that the prosecutor wanted to meet with me the next morning to discuss the case. He said police had found a laptop in Holden's motel room with detailed plans for evading capture. Holden had done research on crossing into Canada illegally, establishing fake identities and living off the grid without being tracked. There were also printouts of news coverage about Professor Adomo's murder, and my name was highlighted in several articles as a person of interest in the case. Detective Williams said it looked like Holden had found some satisfaction in seeing me implicated in the crime he committed, which made me feel sick to my stomach. All that planning and calculation, and he had actually enjoyed watching me suffer for something he did. I finally called my parents back and told them that Holden was in custody. My mom started crying on the phone and said they were driving up first thing the next morning no matter what the police had said before about staying home. I didn't have the energy to argue with her, and honestly I wanted my parents there even though I was supposed to be an adult who could handle difficult things alone. My dad asked if I wanted to come home and transfer to a different school for next semester, and I told him I didn't know what I wanted anymore except to feel safe again. Everything felt uncertain and scary, and I couldn't think past the next few hours, much less make decisions about my whole future. That night in the hotel room, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, completely unable to sleep. My mind kept replaying all the normal times Holden and I had hung out like regular roommates. Watching movies on his laptop on weekend nights, complaining about how hard our classes were, ordering pizza at midnight when we were both stressed about exams. I remembered him helping me study for a biology midterm, patiently explaining concepts I didn't understand until they finally made sense. I remembered him giving me advice about a girl I liked in my English class, telling me to be confident and just ask her out. None of it felt real anymore. I didn't know if any of those moments had been genuine, or if he was just pretending the whole time, maintaining a normal roommate cover while he planned murder. Was he ever actually my friend? Or was I always just a convenient tool he could use for his sick plan? The next morning, I met with the prosecutor at her downtown office. She was a serious woman in her 40s who got straight to business without much small talk. She explained that the charges against Holden included first-degree murder, attempted obstruction of justice, and stalking. She said the evidence was overwhelming and they expected him to be convicted, but she warned me that trials can take a year or more to actually happen. I would need to stay available to testify about finding Professor Adomo's body and about living with Holden without noticing his dangerous behavior. She also warned me to expect Holden's defense attorney to try discrediting me or suggesting I was somehow involved in the murder, even though the evidence clearly showed I was innocent. Defense lawyers look for any way to create reasonable doubt in the jury's mind. I felt overwhelmed thinking about a whole year of waiting with this hanging over me, and then eventually having to face Holden in a courtroom and relive everything in front of strangers. The next morning, my parents showed up at the hotel before I even finished breakfast. My mom came through the door and grabbed me in a hug so tight I could barely breathe, and she kept saying she was so sorry and that everything would be okay now. My dad stood behind her looking like he wanted to hit something or someone, his jaw clenched and his hands and fists at his sides. When my mom finally let go, my dad shook my hand and then pulled me into a quick hug that felt awkward but genuine. We went down to the hotel restaurant and ordered food that I mostly pushed around on my plate while they asked careful questions about how I was holding up. I tried to explain that I felt like an idiot for not seeing what Holden really was, and that I felt violated knowing he'd been planning murder while we watched movies together in our dorm room. My mom reached across the table and squeezed my hand, telling me that predators are good at hiding what they are and that I shouldn't blame myself. My dad wanted to know every detail about the investigation and what would happen next, asking questions about the evidence and the charges like he was trying to understand how the system would punish Holden. After we finished eating, my mom suggested I come home for a while and take a break from the school, maybe finish the semester online from the safety of my childhood bedroom. I told her I needed to think about it because part of me wanted to run home and hide, but another part of me didn't want Holden to have that power over my life. My dad said whatever I decided they would support me, and that the most important thing was that I felt safe and could start healing from this nightmare. We spent the rest of the day together just walking around downtown and talking about normal things like my classes and their jobs, trying to pretend everything was fine, even though none of us could stop thinking about Holden sitting in a jail cell somewhere. When they dropped me back at the hotel that evening, my mom made me promise to call them every day, and my dad slipped me some cash in case I needed anything. I went up to my room and lay on the bed staring at the ceiling, feeling exhausted but unable to sleep, because my brain wouldn't stop replaying every interaction I'd ever had with Holden and looking for signs I'd missed. The next afternoon, Detective called my cell phone and asked if I could come back to the station because Holden was asking to speak with me. My stomach dropped and I asked why Holden would want to talk to me, and Detective explained that Holden's lawyer thought a conversation might help his client decide whether to take a plea deal or go to trial. I put Detective on speaker so my parents could hear, and my dad immediately said absolutely not, that there was no way I should have to face the person who tried to destroy my life. But I felt this weird pull to hear what Holden had to say, like maybe if I understood his reasoning, I could make sense of what happened. Detective assured me I would be completely safe, that Holden would be in handcuffs the entire time, and that Detective would be right there with me in the room. He said I could leave whenever I wanted, and that nobody would force me to do anything I wasn't comfortable with. My mom looked worried, but she said it was my choice, and my dad argued that I didn't owe Holden anything, and shouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing how much he'd hurt me. I thought about it for a few minutes while they all waited, and then I told Detective I would do it tomorrow morning. My dad shook his head but didn't argue anymore, and my mom made me promise I would call her right after it was over. That night I barely slept, tossing and turning while imagining what Holden would say and how I would react. I kept thinking about all the times he'd seemed like a normal guy, helping me with homework or making jokes about our professors and trying to match that person with someone capable of murder. The next morning I met Detective at the police station, and he walked me through what would happen, explaining that Holden's lawyer would be there and that I should feel free to end the conversation at any point. We walked down a long hallway to a small interview room with a metal table and chairs, and Detective opened the door for me. Holden sat on the far side of the table in an orange jumpsuit, with his hands cuffed in front of him, and he looked smaller somehow, like he'd shrunk since the last time I saw him. His face was pale and he had dark circles under his eyes, and his hair was messy like he hadn't bothered to comb it in days. He wouldn't look at me when I first walked in, just stared down at the table while his lawyer sat beside him shuffling papers and looking professional but bored. Detective pulled out a chair for me and then sat down next to me, close enough that I could feel his presence as a protective barrier between me and Holden. The room was quiet except for the buzz of fluorescent lights overhead, and I could hear my own breathing loud in my ears. Holden finally looked up and met my eyes, and for a second he looked like the roommate I knew before everything went wrong. He opened his mouth and said he was sorry for involving me, and his voice sounded rough, like he'd been crying or hadn't used it much lately. I felt anger surge up in my chest because sorry seemed like such a pathetic word for what he'd done to me. I asked him why he killed Professor, and why he tried to frame me for it, keeping my voice steady even though my hands were shaking under the table. Holden's lawyer started to say something, but Holden waved him off and said he wanted to explain, that he needed me to understand, even though he knew I would probably hate him forever. He took a breath and started talking about Abigail, saying she was his girlfriend back in high school before she graduated and went to college. He said they'd been together for almost a year, and she promised she would wait for him while he finished his senior year, but then she broke up with him through a text message saying she needed to move on with her life. When Holden came to this university the next year, he discovered Abigail was here and tried to reconnect with her, but she acted like she barely remembered him and brushed him off. Then he found out she was involved with Professor, and he said it felt like the Professor had stolen his future and ruined everything he'd planned with Abigail. He talked about watching them together and feeling like Professor didn't deserve her, that he was just using her and would probably dump her eventually. I interrupted him and said that was completely insane reasoning for murder, that Abigail had every right to move on with her life, and that he had no claim on her just because they dated in high school. Holden got defensive and his voice got louder as he said, "I didn't understand what it was like to have someone take away your dreams and leave you with nothing." His lawyer put a hand on his arm trying to calm him down, and Detective tensed in the chair next to me like he was ready to intervene if things got out of hand. Holden kept going, saying he chose me as the fall guy because I was convenient, that I had the right major and the right schedule and the right level of desperation about my grades. He said it wasn't personal, and that he actually liked me as a roommate, which somehow made everything feel worse because it meant our friendship was real to me, but just a cover story to him. I asked about the threatening text and photo he sent after I talked to police, and Holden admitted he panicked when he realized they were onto him. He thought maybe if he scared me enough I could convince the police they had the wrong person, or that I would run and make myself look guilty instead. His thinking made absolutely no sense, and I realized he wasn't some criminal genius, but just a disturbed person whose plans fell apart as soon as real investigators looked at the evidence. I told him I was done listening and pushed my chair back from the table, walking out of the room without looking back at him. Detective followed me into the hallway and closed the door behind us, and I leaned against the wall trying to catch my breath. Detective said Holden's confession would help secure a conviction, even though his lawyer had tried to stop him from talking, and that the prosecutor would probably offer a plea deal of life in prison without parole to avoid a trial. I asked if I would still have to testify in court, and Detective said probably not if Holden pleaded guilty, which would save me from having to relive everything in front of a jury. Over the next few weeks, I met with the campus counselor twice a week to process everything that had happened. At first, I felt panicked every time I thought about Holden or Professor, or that horrible day I found the body, but slowly the panic started turning into anger. The counselor said anger was a healthy response and helped me work through it in productive ways instead of letting it eat me up inside. My parents drove up every weekend to check on me and take me out to dinner, and knowing they were there made me feel less alone, even though I was still staying in the hotel. My friends from class started texting me regularly, asking how I was doing, and a few of them came by to study with me at the coffee shop near campus. Cillian from my biology class started meeting me at the library a couple times a week, and he became a good friend who treated me like a normal person instead of some fragile victim who might break. He made jokes and complained about his professors and asked my opinion on regular stuff, which helped me feel like I was still myself underneath all the trauma. One day, the university housing office called and offered me a single room in a different dorm building on the other side of campus, saying I could move in whenever I was ready. I thought about staying in the hotel forever because it felt safe and separate from everything that happened, but I knew I couldn't hide there for the rest of the semester. I called Cillian and asked if he would help me pack up my stuff from the old room, and he said yes immediately and brought 2 other friends with him. Walking back into that dorm room was harder than I expected because everything reminded me of Holden, from his empty desk to the posters we'd hung together on the walls. My stuff was still exactly where I'd left it the night before everything went wrong, and it felt like walking into a time capsule of my old life before I knew my roommate was a murderer. Cillian and the others worked quickly, packing my clothes and books and random belongings into boxes while making small talk to distract me from the memories flooding my brain. We got everything done in one afternoon and loaded it all into Cillian's car to drive across campus to my new building. My new room was smaller than the old one, but it was all mine, with just 1 bed and 1 desk and 1 closet that nobody else would touch. I unpacked my boxes and arranged everything the way I wanted it, and when I was done, I locked the door and sat on my bed feeling something like peace for the first time in weeks. The lock was solid and I was alone and nobody could get to me here, and that feeling of safety was worth more than any amount of space or fancy amenities. A few days later, my phone rang while I was studying at my desk, and I saw Detective Williams' name on the screen. I answered, and he told me that Holden's lawyer had worked out a plea deal with the prosecutor for life in prison without any chance of parole. The detective explained this meant there wouldn't be a trial, and I wouldn't have to testify in court or face Holden again. I felt this weird mix of relief and disappointment wash over me, because part of me had wanted to stand up in front of a jury and tell everyone what he did to me. Detective Williams must have heard something in my voice because he asked if I was okay with the outcome. I told him I guess so, but it felt unfinished somehow, like I'd been building up to this big moment that wasn't going to happen now. He said he understood, but reminded me that trials can be brutal for victims, and this way I could move forward without months of legal stress. After we hung up, I sat there staring at my phone for a long time, trying to figure out why I felt cheated when this was supposed to be good news. My next counseling session was 2 days later, and I brought up these confusing feelings with the counselor. She listened while I explained how I'd imagined myself in court, making Holden hear everything he put me through. The counselor nodded and said it was normal to want that kind of public validation and closure. She reminded me that my healing wasn't dependent on any courtroom drama, and that my safety mattered more than any satisfying moment of confrontation. We talked through it for the whole session, and by the end I felt better about accepting the plea deal as a win, even if it didn't feel dramatic enough. The next week, Detective Williams called again and said that Abigail Fisher wanted to talk to me if I was willing. He gave me her number, and I sat on my bed for 20 minutes before I finally texted her. She responded right away, suggesting we meet at a coffee shop a few blocks from campus. I agreed, and we set it up for the following afternoon. When I walked into the coffee shop, I recognized her immediately from seeing her around campus and from the investigation. She looked tired and sad, and she stood up when she saw me coming. We got our drinks and sat at a corner table away from other people. Abigail started crying almost immediately and apologized for everything, even though none of it was her fault. She told me she had no idea Holden existed, or that he was obsessed with her from high school. I asked her about Professor Adomo and what he was really like beyond just being my professor. She smiled through her tears and talked about how passionate he was about teaching and how he genuinely cared about his students succeeding. We ended up talking for over 2 hours about the professor and about what Holden did and how we were both trying to process this nightmare. Sharing grief with someone who actually knew the professor and understood what I was going through helped more than I expected. When we finally left the coffee shop, Abigail hugged me and said we should stay in touch. I agreed, and we exchanged numbers for real this time. Weeks passed in a blur of final exams and papers, and somehow I managed to pass all my classes despite missing so much time and being unable to focus. When I checked my grades online and saw that I'd actually done it, I felt genuinely proud of myself for the first time in months. My parents drove up that weekend and took me out to a nice restaurant to celebrate finishing the semester. My mom kept saying how proud she was that I got through everything, and my dad raised his glass in a toast to my strength. During dinner, they brought up the idea of me transferring to a school closer to home where they could keep an eye on me. I thought about it seriously for a minute because part of me wanted to run away from this campus and everything that happened here. But then I realized that transferring wouldn't actually help me heal, and I'd built real support systems here with Sabine and the counselor and friends like Cillian. I told my parents I was staying and they looked worried but said they respected my decision. My mom made me promise to keep going to counseling and to call them if I ever felt unsafe. I promised and meant it because I knew I couldn't do this alone. A few days after that conversation, a girl named Trinity Harding sent me a message through the university email system. She introduced herself and said she'd been following what happened with Holden and wanted to start a campus safety group. Trinity explained that the group would focus on teaching students how to recognize warning signs of dangerous behavior and report concerns properly. She asked if I would be interested in helping since I had firsthand experience with missing red flags. I thought about it for a day before responding yes, because maybe I could help prevent someone else from going through what I did. We met at the student center the following week, along with a few other students Trinity had recruited. Our first planning meeting had 15 people show up, which surprised both of us. Everyone shared ideas about what kind of educational events we could organize for next semester. Trinity took notes and assigned different people to research various topics. I volunteered to help develop materials about recognizing obsessive behavior, since that's what I'd failed to notice with Holden. By the end of the meeting, we had a rough plan for workshops and awareness campaigns. Walking back to my dorm, I felt like I was doing something meaningful instead of just being a victim. The following week, Detective Williams stopped by campus and asked if we could grab coffee. We went to the same place where I'd met Abigail, and he updated me on a few things. He told me that Holden's father never contacted the police or visited his son in jail even once. The detective said this helped explain some of Holden's issues, but obviously didn't excuse what he did. I asked if they'd learned anything else about Holden's past, and Detective Williams mentioned they'd found evidence of other concerning behavior in high school that his father had apparently covered up. We talked about Trinity's safety group, and he seemed genuinely impressed that I was channeling what happened into helping others. Before he left, he gave me his card again and told me to call any time if I needed anything. A few days later, Owen Hamilton, the campus security officer who'd helped with the investigation, stopped me outside the library. He said he'd heard about Trinity's group and wanted to help coordinate with campus police on safety initiatives. I gave him Trinity's contact information, and he promised to reach out. Over the next few weeks, I kept meeting people who genuinely cared about making campus safer, and it felt good to be building relationships based on helping others instead of just surviving trauma. When spring semester started in January, I felt like I was in a better place mentally, even though I still had rough moments. Some nights I woke up from nightmares about finding Professor Adomo's body and had to remind myself I was safe in my locked room. During the day, I sometimes felt anxious walking past the building where it all happened. My counseling sessions helped me work through these reactions, and the counselor kept assuring me this was normal trauma response that would fade over time. Cillian and I started hanging out more, and he introduced me to his friend group. They were all nice people who treated me normally instead of like some fragile victim who might break. We studied together at the library and went to movies and got food at the dining hall. Having regular social connections again made me feel less isolated by what happened. Cillian never pushed me to talk about the murder unless I brought it up first, and I appreciated that more than he probably knew. A month into the semester, the university held a memorial service for Professor Adomo in the main chapel. I almost didn't go because I wasn't sure I could handle it, but Abigail texted asking if I'd be there, and I decided to show up. The chapel was packed with students and faculty and people who knew the professor. Abigail sat in the front row, and I found a seat toward the middle. Different people got up and shared memories about Professor Adomo's passion for teaching and his kindness to students. Abigail spoke last, and her words were beautiful and sad. She talked about how much he loved his work and how he always made time to help students who were struggling. Hearing everyone's positive memories helped me remember that he was a real person with people who loved him, not just a victim in a horrible crime story. After the service ended, several students came up to me and quietly thanked me for helping catch his killer. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded and tried not to cry. Over the next few weeks, Trinity's safety awareness group grew from 15 members to over 50. We organized our first workshop series in different dorms about recognizing concerning behavior and knowing how to report it properly. Wayne Fuller, the guy who'd been Holden's roommate freshman year, joined our group and agreed to share his experience. During one workshop, Wayne stood up and talked about the warning signs he'd noticed with Holden and how much he regretted not filing official reports. His honesty made a real impact on the students listening. Owen Hamilton came to several workshops and explained the proper channels for reporting safety concerns to campus police. The response was better than any of us expected, and students kept coming up afterward with questions and their own stories. By the end of the semester, the university administration scheduled a meeting with Trinity and committed funding to expand our programming next year. By mid-semester, I'd made a big decision about my future. I went to Sabine's office and told her I wanted to change my major to criminal justice. She asked why, and I explained that this whole experience showed me how important good investigators like Detective Williams are. I wanted to help solve cases and support victims going through what I went through. Sabine pulled up the criminal justice requirements on her computer, and we spent an hour planning out my new coursework. She promised to connect me with professors in that department and help me explore internship opportunities. Walking out of her office, I felt like I had a clear direction that came from surviving something terrible and wanting to make meaning from it. The idea of spending my career helping victims and catching criminals felt right in a way my old major never had. 6 months after finding Professor Adomo's body, I was doing well enough that my counselor suggested reducing our sessions from weekly to every other week. We'd processed most of the trauma, and I'd developed solid coping strategies for when I felt triggered or anxious. I still had bad days, but they were getting less frequent and less intense. My parents visited that weekend and took me to lunch. My mom commented that I seemed more like myself again, and my dad agreed. I told them I felt different, though, fundamentally changed by what happened. They nodded and said that made sense, but they were proud of how I'd grown through it. Sitting there with them, I realized I'd survived something that could have destroyed me and come out stronger on the other side. A couple weeks after that conversation with my parents, Cillian caught me after class and asked if I wanted to grab coffee. We sat in the campus coffee shop and he brought up next year's housing, asking if I'd thought about where I wanted to live. I told him I hadn't really planned that far ahead because everything still felt so weird. He nodded and then asked if I wanted to room with him and his friend Jansen in a 3-bedroom apartment off campus. I felt my chest get tight because the idea of trusting a roommate again scared me, but I also knew I couldn't let what Holden did make me paranoid forever. I told Cillian I needed to think about it, and he said no pressure, just let him know. Over the next few days, I talked to my counselor about it, and she pointed out that avoiding roommates meant letting Holden's actions control my future. That made sense, so I texted Cillian and said yes. We spent the following weekend looking at apartments near campus and found a decent 3-bedroom place about 10 minutes from the main buildings. The landlord did a background check and we signed the lease for next fall. Having concrete plans for the future made me feel like I was actually moving forward instead of just surviving day to day. Detective Williams called me a few weeks later and asked if I'd be willing to speak to a group of new police recruits about my experience as a crime victim and witness. He explained that hearing from actual victims helps officers understand why their behavior during investigations matters so much. I agreed because I remembered how Detective Williams treated me with respect, even when I was a suspect, and how much that mattered. The following Tuesday, I drove to the police training facility and met a room full of about 30 recruits in uniform. Detective Williams introduced me, and I stood up front feeling nervous as hell. I talked for maybe 20 minutes about finding Professor Adomo's body, being suspected of murder, how scared I was, and how Detective Williams's professionalism helped me get through it. The recruits asked really good questions about what officers said that helped versus what made things worse, and about how they should treat people who might be suspects, but also might be victims. After the presentation ended, several recruits came up to thank me, and one woman told me that hearing my story would definitely change how she approaches investigations. Driving home, I felt good about doing something useful with what happened to me. A few days later, I ran into Barrett Chandler outside the library, and we both kind of froze for a second. We'd both been caught up in Holden's manipulation, but hadn't really talked since everything went down. Barrett spoke first and said he was glad they caught the right person, and I said, yeah, me too. We ended up walking to a bench and talking for almost an hour about how weird it was that Holden created that fake social media account to push Barrett into being more aggressive toward Professor Adomo. Barrett told me he changed his major to psychology because he wanted to understand what makes people like Holden do what they do. I mentioned I'd switched to criminal justice for similar reasons. We exchanged numbers and started meeting up sometimes to study at the library, and it felt good to be friends with someone who understood the weird situation we'd both been in. Spring semester moved fast with all of Trinity's safety group activities ramping up. We spent weeks planning a big campus safety fair, and the day finally came in early April. We set up tables all over the main quad with information about recognizing warning signs, reporting concerns to campus police and mental health resources. Hundreds of students stopped by throughout the day, and Owen Hamilton brought several other campus security officers to answer questions and hand out their contact information. Detective Williams even showed up for a couple hours to support us, which meant a lot. The biggest moment came when the university president walked through with some administrators and stopped at our main table. Trinity gave him a quick presentation about our programs and policy recommendations, and he told us right there in front of everyone that the university would implement several of our suggestions starting next fall. We'd be getting funding to expand the program, better training for resident advisors, and improved reporting systems. Walking back to my dorm that night, I felt like we'd actually accomplished something real. The 1-year anniversary of Professor Adomo's death hit me harder than I expected. I woke up that morning and just felt heavy, remembering exactly what I'd been doing that same day last year. Abigail texted me asking if I wanted to visit his grave together, and I said yes. We met at the cemetery that afternoon and walked to his headstone carrying flowers. Abigail put hers down first and stood there quietly for a minute. She told me she was in therapy too and slowly getting better at dealing with losing him. I asked how she was doing otherwise, and she said she was actually dating someone new, a guy who treated her really well and knew about everything that happened. We sat on a bench near the grave and talked about how we'd become genuine friends through all this shared grief, which felt strange but also right. Abigail said she thought Professor Adoma would be happy that something positive came from the tragedy, like our friendship and all the safety work happening on campus. I agreed, and we sat there a while longer before heading back to our cars. About a week later, I checked my campus mailbox and found a letter forwarded from the prison system. My hands started shaking when I saw Holden's name on the return address. My first thought was to just throw it away without opening it, but then I remembered my counselor always said avoiding things usually makes them worse. I brought the letter to my next counseling session, and we talked about whether I should read it. She said it was completely my choice, but that sometimes hearing what someone has to say can provide closure, even if it's not what you want to hear. I decided to read it that night in my dorm room. The letter was 3 pages long, and Holden's handwriting looked messy and rushed. He started by saying he knew I probably hated him and he deserved that. Then he wrote about being obsessed and delusional, and how nothing justified what he did to Professor Adomo, or how he tried to frame me. He said he thinks about the professor every day and wishes more than anything he could undo it. The last paragraph said he hoped I could eventually forgive him, even though he knew he didn't deserve it, and that he was sorry for destroying my sense of safety. Reading it made me feel weird and angry and sad all at once. I put the letter in my desk drawer and didn't look at it again for a few days. Then one night I sat down and wrote a response. I kept it to 1 page and made my feelings clear. I told Holden I didn't forgive him and probably never would, but that I'd moved forward with my life and he no longer had any power over me. I explained that I was studying criminal justice now and doing safety advocacy work, and that his actions ended up pushing me towards something meaningful, even though that obviously wasn't his intention. I wrote that I hoped he spent his life in prison thinking about the harm he caused and maybe finding some way to do good from where he was. I sealed the envelope and mailed it the next day, and afterward I felt this unexpected sense of closure, like I'd said what I needed to say and could finally let it go. My criminal justice classes that semester went really well, and I ended up with strong grades in everything. A couple professors pulled me aside separately to mention internship opportunities with law enforcement agencies and victim services organizations. One professor even wrote me a recommendation letter without me asking, saying my personal experience combined with my academic performance made me an ideal candidate for the field. When moving day came at the end of the semester, Cillian and Jansen helped me pack up my stuff and move it to our new apartment. The place felt bigger and brighter than my dorm room, and having my own space that I could actually decorate felt amazing. I hung up photos of my family and friends, put up a couple posters, and arranged my desk by the window. That night, the 3 of us ordered pizza and sat in our new living room talking about summer plans and classes for next year. It felt like a genuine fresh start. Detective Williams called me in early May with news that caught me completely off guard. He said the police department was looking for a summer intern to work in victim services, and he wanted to know if I'd be interested. I said yes immediately without even thinking about it. He explained I'd be helping victims navigate the criminal justice system, connecting them with resources and learning about investigations from the support side. He told me I had good instincts and the right attitude for this kind of work, and that my personal experience would help me understand what victims go through. I started the internship 2 weeks later and spent my days at the police station helping people who'd been through crimes, filing paperwork, and sitting in on victim interviews. It felt good to use what I'd learned to actually help other people. The biggest thing that happened that spring was Trinity getting an email from some national campus safety organization saying our group won an award for advocacy work. None of us could believe it at first. The organization invited us to their annual conference to accept the award and present our programs to representatives from other universities. Trinity, Wayne, and I flew out together in late May and spent 3 days at this huge conference with hundreds of student safety advocates from all over the country. On the last day, we stood on stage in front of everyone and accepted the award, then did a presentation about our workshops and policy changes. People asked tons of questions afterward, and several schools said they wanted to implement similar programs. When we finished, the whole room gave us a standing ovation, and I felt this rush of pride knowing that one terrible event had somehow sparked changes that would help protect students at universities everywhere. Flying home, I looked out the window and thought about how far I'd come from that scared kid who found his professor's body and got accused of murder. I'd survived something that could have broken me and turned it into something that might actually save lives. 2 years later, I'm sitting in my apartment filling out paperwork for graduate programs in forensic psychology, and I still can't believe how different my life looks now. I got accepted to 5 different programs and spent weeks talking with Detective Williams about which one would set me up best for the career I want. My internship at the police department turned into a real job where I help crime victims figure out the legal system and connect them with counselors and support services. Last week, I sat with a woman whose husband was killed in a robbery and held her hand while she cried, and I knew exactly what to say because I'd been there too. Detective Williams takes me to lunch once a month and tells me about cases he's working on, asking my opinion about victim interviews and how to make people feel safe enough to talk. He wrote one of my recommendation letters for grad school and told me I have better instincts than officers with 10 years experience. The work feels right in a way nothing else ever has, like I found the thing I'm supposed to do with my life. My partner and I met at one of Trinity's safety workshops and started dating 6 months ago, and they understand the hard days without making me feel broken or damaged. Cillian is still my best friend, and we live 2 blocks apart now, meeting up most weekends to cook dinner and watch movies like normal people in their 20s. Trinity's group keeps growing, and we present at conferences twice a year, teaching other schools how to build similar programs. I still have days where I wake up anxious or have nightmares about finding Professor Adomo's body, but mostly I feel grateful for the people who helped me survive that nightmare and proud of who I became because of it. What Holden did was awful, and it changed me forever, but it didn't destroy me like he probably hoped it would. Instead, it showed me I'm stronger than I thought and pointed me toward work that actually matters. I help people every single day who are going through the worst moments of their lives, and I make the system a little bit better and a little bit kinder. Some mornings I think about how scared I was in that police station 2 years ago, certain my life was over and I barely recognized that version of myself anymore.